In Judges chapter 6 and 7 and 8, to say what I've said the last few times, we're in the fourth complete cycle of Israel's disobedience and Israel's idolatry. Israel, as we saw, continued worshiping the false gods of Canaan. As a result of that, Yahweh gave them over to the hands of another foreign force, this time the Midianites. And as a result of 7 years of Midianite oppression, Israel has cried out to Yahweh for deliverance, and that's where we are. Yahweh has raised up a judge, and his name is Gideon. Just quickly to show you where we are again, the map on the left is probably easier to see. It's Israel with the Jordan River right in the middle of it. Remember that there were three tribes, the tribe of Gad, Reuben, and the half of the tribe of Manasseh. When they were going to the promised land, they said, hey, the land is really nice here for flocks, for herds, for the kind of work that we do. Can we stay on the east side of the river and not cross into the promised land across the Jordan? And so that's exactly where Moses gave them land, on the wrong side, if you will, of the promised land. The 9.5 tribes did cross over at Jericho here, and this is what modern-day Israel looks like, right? Well, I'm talking about simply the geography. And we have the 9.5 tribes, the sons of Jacob, broken up there into their tribal allotments that Joshua gave them. So that's where we are. That red circle is where we are during the time of Gideon. Everything we're reading about in Judges 6, 7, and 8, the Ein Herod that we'll talk about in just a minute, the spring of Herod, is in that river valley in the Jezreel Valley. So just to show you where we are. So we're going to pick up here with the idea that Yahweh wanted a public demonstration from Gideon. Remember, Yahweh spoke to Gideon, the angel of the Lord. Gideon asked for a sign. The angel of the Lord gave him a sign. Gideon had made an altar. He made a meal. He put the meal on the altar. The angel of the Lord touched with his staff this food, the broth and everything, and it was consumed by fire. So Gideon has made a personal demonstration to God. But God wants a more public demonstration from Gideon. And so what we see here is God telling Gideon to destroy the altar to the king, or to the god, the false god Baal, and the Asherah pole to the false god Asherah that's in Gideon's father's backyard. God wants Gideon to publicly, before the Israelites in Manasseh, in the tribal area of Manasseh, he wants him to make a public demonstration of the fact that he is with Yahweh and is Yahweh's raised up judge. So that's what we're going to see in just a minute. Before we go there, I want to go back to Moses' day for just a second. I want to backtrack about 80 years, 60 years maybe, to Moses' day and see what Yahweh said to Moses. Before we see that passage, just a quick review, a timeline review quickly, just to show where we are in the book of Judges. What period of Israel's history does the book of Judges cover? It's important to know where we are when we read the Bible. And it covers this period from the death of Joshua, who led Israel into the promised land, was there 30, 35, 40 years. After that event, after Joshua died, that's when the book of Judges takes up, and it goes all the way to the monarchy, meaning when a king is called in Israel, King Saul is chosen. So the period between the death of Joshua and the birth of the monarchy is when this 300-year period of the book of Judges takes place. 1350 to 1050 BC. It was approximately 1050 BC when Saul became the first king of Israel. So that's the time period we're talking about. I can't tell you, no one could tell you exactly where in that 300-year period each of these judges fall, but we're somewhere in the middle of that when Gideon comes up. So we see in the book of Judges approximately 300 years of Jewish history. I went over this when we started Judges, but now that we've gone through some of it and you get the flow of Judges and the idea of the cycle and what's happening, I think it's important to go back and say, okay, now I understand this slide better, the timing in which we're talking about. So 300 years of Jewish history, just to put, you may say, boy, we're taking our time in the book of Judges. Usually in this Old Testament survey, I cover a chapter a session, and we have taken a little more time than that. And that's because 30% of the nation, of all of national Israel's history, 30% of it is written and recorded in the book of Judges. That's a substantial piece of their national history. 30% of what we read about Israel, and I'm talking about from Mount Sinai, when Moses got the law, all the way until the end of the book of Malachi, 1,000-year period goes by, and 30% of it is written about in the book of Judges. So it's an important book, I'll say that. So 1446 BC, when Israel leaves Egypt under Moses' direction, Moses' leadership, all the way to 430 BC, the end of the writing of Malachi. That's the period of the Old Testament, about 1,000 years. Again, Judges covers 30% of all Jewish history we read about in the Old Testament. Just as a comparison, because we just finished the book of Joshua, the book of Joshua covered less than 40 years. So Judges covers in 24 chapters what Joshua covered in many chapters only 40 years. Judges covers 300 years, just to show you how important this book is. I want to go back to Moses' day. So backtrack 40, 50, 60 years to the days when Moses is still alive. God is speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai. The reason I'm going here is because God is telling Gideon, I want a public display of worship of me. I want you to tear down the altars, and I want you to smash the Asherah poles. Or smash the altars and tear down the Asherah poles. And where did he get that idea? Had God given that instruction before? Is this what Israel should have done years before when they entered the land of Canaan? The answer is yes. So in Exodus chapter 34, verse 10, God is speaking to Moses. Moses has come back up to Mount Sinai. He's got 2 new tablets of the law that he's carved out, and God's going to write on them. And this is what God tells Moses. He says, behold, I'm going to make a covenant before all your people. Now listen, the very last thing that God talked about as being the most impressive thing He's ever done was the 10 plagues in Egypt, bringing Israel out of Egypt, the Red Sea, the parting of the sea. And now He says, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something new that's even more spectacular than that. He says, I'm going to make a covenant before all your people, Israel. I will perform miracles which have not been produced in all the earth, nor among any of the nations. And all of the people among whom you live will see the working of Yahweh, not Baal, not Asherah, not Dagon, not Milcom, not any of the false gods that they were worshiping in Canaan. They will see the power of Yahweh. For it is a fearful thing that I'm going to perform for you. Look what he says in the next verse. He tells what he's talking about. He says, be sure to observe what I'm commanding you this day. Behold, I am going to drive out stronger nations, established nations. I'm going to drive out the Amorite before you, and the Canaanite and the Hittite. We've seen all these nations. These are the Canaanite nations that lived in that geographic area we call Israel today. The Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. The covenant was between Israel and Yahweh, the Mosaic covenant. He said, don't make any other covenant with any other person anywhere on this earth. Your covenant is with me. The agreement is with me. Not with the people, not with their gods. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going. That's Canaan. Or, if you do, it will become a snare in your midst. Look at the next 2 verses. But rather than making a covenant with the people and their false gods, in order that you might keep purified the covenant that I have made with you on Mount Sinai through Moses, this is what God commanded Israel to do. You are to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and cut down their asherim, their Asherah poles. Im on the end of the Hebrew word makes it plural. Cut down all of their Asherah poles because they cover the land. And he answers the question, well, why would we do that? Why can't we leave them? He says, for you shall not worship any other God. For Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. The word for jealous here is the Hebrew word kana, and it means fiercely protective and unaccepting of disloyalty. That's who our God is. He's fiercely protective, and He's unaccepting of any disloyalty. He's jealous. He puts it another way in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 8. Years later, He says, I am Yahweh, that is my name, and I will not give my glory to another. Another what? Another anything. No created thing, no imaginary thing, nothing. I am Yahweh, and all glory should go to Him. He said, I am Yahweh, that is my name. You wonder why I call Him Yahweh? Because He says that's His name. And I'll not give my glory to another, nor my praise that's deserving to only me. I won't share my praise with graven images. What's another word for pestle, graven images? Idols. So he says, when Israel goes into the land, you are to cut down, smash, tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, cut down their asherim, and that's exactly what he asked Gideon to do. The people, Israel, didn't do it. I'll prove it to you. Look what it says in Exodus 34. Well, this isn't proof of it. I'll show you proof in a minute. Otherwise, God continues talking to Moses. If you don't cut down all their false god worship centers, otherwise you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his ungodly false god animal sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, intermarriage with the Canaanite pagans, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons, Israel, Jewish men, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. And that's exactly what God warned them of, is exactly where Israel is in Judges chapter 6. They've done everything you're seeing in those two verses. They've fallen for all of it. They've intermarried, they've played the harlot with the other gods, they've sacrificed to them, now they're worshiping them. Exactly what God said would happen if they didn't destroy idolatry. That's what's going on. From the human perspective, I've showed you this before also. I just want to put it back in your streams of consciousness now that we're into this book. From the human perspective, the book of Judges is a story of disobedience and disaster. That's what we see over and over in the book of Judges. There's a 3-step progression into Israel's idolatry. God just said it in Exodus 34, and we see it in the book of Judges. They lived among unbelieving Canaanites. What were they supposed to do to every Canaanite in the land when they went into the land of Canaan? What did Yahweh command Moses and Israel to do to everything that breathed in the land of Canaan? Kill it. Purify the land. I've given them 400 years, the iniquity of the Amorites. He gave them 400 years to come to worship God. They wouldn't come to worship Yahweh. Time is up. Kill everything that breathes, he says. But what did they do instead? They did not kill every one of the pagan Canaanites. Instead, they lived among the unbelieving Canaanites. Step 1 in compromise. Step 2, they intermarried. The sons, they took the daughters, they took the pagan daughters for their own sons. They sent their daughters to the pagan men, And they just made this mess in Israel of intermarriage. God told them to never do that, but that's exactly what they did. So step 2, they intermarried with pagan Canaanites. Excuse me for that. And step 3, what's the next logical conclusion? What did God say? Otherwise, you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. And so what did Israel do after they intermarried? They started worshiping the false gods of Canaan. That's exactly what they did. It's exactly what we see in the church, and we talked about this a while back. Exactly what we see in the church when our sons and daughters go marry somebody that's not biblical Christian, not a biblical Christian. The chances of you bringing in someone into the church to worship God the way you do are so very, very slim. The chance of that person driving your kid away, 99%. It's what God says. Somehow and for some reason, worship of false gods to the human mind is more attractive than worship of the one true God, Yahweh. We see it over and over in history. So from the human perspective, this is what we see. They lived among the unbelieving Canaanites. They intermarried with them, and they started worshiping their gods. And when we started the book of Judges in chapter 3, we got a report card of Israel. We got an evaluation of them. How are they doing? And look what it says. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites. They didn't kill them. They lived among them. We'll do it our way, Lord. I know you wanted to purify the land and purge them of all this evil and ungodliness, but we'll do it our way. Disaster every time. So they lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. What's the next step? They took their daughters for themselves as wives. What's the next step? They gave their own daughters to their sons. The ultimate step, they served their gods. Exactly what God said would happen is exactly what happens. It's what happened thousands of years ago in the book of Judges. It's what will happen next week if you allow someone you love to marry someone that's a non-biblical Christian. This is what happens. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? It's what happens. They go and serve their gods. So there's the human perspective. But from the divine perspective, so you say, oh my goodness, the book of Judges is just such a downer, man. Can't we move away from this? I didn't write the book. God wrote the Bible. God, every scripture, all scriptures, God breathed and profitable. So from the divine perspective, what are we to see in the book of Judges? Why do we go through it? We see Yahweh's continued direction and deliverance. He doesn't leave Israel. Israel does exactly what he tells them not to do. When what does God do? That's it. Washes his hands of them. I'm out. Forget the covenant at Sinai. It's off. Is that what God does? Or does God double down on his promises to Adam to save, to bring a deliverer that would cancel sin, that would take sin away? His promises to Abraham of a land and a seed and a blessing. His promises to Moses through the 613 laws of the Mosaic Law. His covenant to be Israel's God. He never wavers from it. He never wavers from it. Regardless of how unfaithful man is, we see in the book of Judges that Yahweh remains faithful. And while we read the book of Judges, we should be reading, oh, thank God that you are a merciful, gracious, forgiving God, faithful to your promises, because if you'd have turned your back on these people, Israel, then who would not have come to earth? Jesus. Jesus the Jew from the tribe of Judah. If God would have said at any time, I will not tolerate and abide the unfaithfulness of Israel, I'm out, then you and I are still dead in our trespasses and sins, separated from God, looking forward to an eternity in the lake of fire. When you read the book of Judges, you should bow before Yahweh for being faithful, for being a God that never abandons His purposes. His purpose is to save mankind through Israel. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you, He told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. He's showing through the book of Judges that he cannot be defeated no matter what enemy Satan brings up to try to destroy Israel. Even though God allows the destruction for a time, his plan will never be defeated. And he shows through, from the divine perspective, when you read the book of Judges, that he always finds others to continue the work that is unfinished. Gideon will say here at least 3 times, I'm not the guy for the job. Just like Moses said at least 3 times, Lord, I'm not the guy for the job. I'm not the guy to send to Pharaoh. I don't have a silver tongue. I can't stand up and speak like that. Moses tried to get out of his calling. Gideon will try to get out of his calling. Show me a sign, show me a sign, show me a sign. I don't have faith enough to do what you're asking me to do. I'm not confident enough in you, Yahweh, and my relationship with you. Show me a sign. And if Gideon would have fallen down, what would have happened to Israel? Would they have crumbled? Would they still be under Midianite oppression today? Or would God have raised up another judge who would have gotten the job done? He'd have raised up another judge, is the answer. So all of that to get back into the book, to give you an idea of where we are, why we're studying the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 6, verse 31, Joash said to all who stood against him. Remember, so Gideon has smashed the altar to Baal. He's cut down the Asherah pole in his father's backyard. He's made an altar and burned a sacrifice to Yahweh, just as Yahweh asked him to. And the men of Israel, the men of Manasseh, are calling for Gideon's life. Instead of cheering Gideon for being the one who's casting off the idolatry and leading Israel back to the worship of the one true God, instead of cheering Gideon and making him their leader, they want him killed. Everything is upside down in Israel right now. They're worshiping the wrong God. Joash said to all who stood against him, this is Gideon's father, will you contend for Baal? Are you going to take up Baal's fight for him? If Baal's altar was smashed, let Baal deal with that. If he's a god, he's more capable than you are anyway. Will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself because someone has torn down his altar. As if to say, if Baal wants Gideon dead for stomping on his altar, then let Baal kill Gideon. Why do you need to fight Baal's fight? Isn't he a god? Interesting that the altar to Baal belonged to Joash. I wonder what the firmness and commitment of his son in doing this overnight did for the faith of his father. Because his father is sure standing up for him here. Verse 32, therefore on that day he named him Yerubbaal. So he changes Gideon's name, that is to say, let Baal contend against him. If Baal wants to fight my son, so be it, but men need to stand down. Yerubbaal. Verse 33, all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of East. So now this has occurred, and now we get back to the war, the problem. Israel is being persecuted by Midian. They come in once a year and they steal all of Israel's food. So God has raised up Gideon to take care of this problem, to defeat the Midianites. And in verse 33, we get back to the idea of there's a war that's about to take place. All the Midianites, Amalekites, and the sons of the east assembled themselves. This is the bad army. They crossed over and they camped in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 34, so the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called together to follow him. So Gideon blows a trumpet, much like this trumpet that I brought. This is what a shofar looks like. I have a longer one that's about this long, and it's easier to blow. But this is the kind of trumpet that we'll read about here in this story when the men blow their trumpets. This is what they would have blown. It's a ram's horn where the hole is cut in the end of it, and you can actually make sound through it. If you want me to make a fool of myself, I'll blow it in a minute. So the Spirit of God, we're talking about God the Holy Spirit, comes upon Gideon. Now, we talked about this a bit, and I'm not going to say any more about it than this. In the Old Testament, God the Holy Spirit did not indwell. He didn't live inside the Jews. He came alongside certain Jews at certain times to enable them to do whatever God called them to do. So he comes alongside. This is all about divine enablement. Strengthening, divine enablement, etc., so that they can perform the tasks that God has called them to perform. The Holy Spirit would come and go in the Old Testament. This endowment, it's called, not indwelling. He would come alongside and then he would leave. He has come into us as church-age Christians and will never leave. Very different. Very different. Verse 35, he sent messengers. So Gideon, still gathering an army, he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. These are the other three tribes, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. So he's amassed an army. And now we see this idea of Gideon putting out the fleece. It seems like Gideon is faithful and loyal and fierce and ready to fight because he's gathered this army, but as we'll see, he's really not. Quickly, God will make certain confirmations to Gideon. We're about to see in chapter 6, verse 36 to 40, this idea of the fleece. Gideon putting out the fleece. Everybody was taught this in Sunday school when you were a little kid, this story of Gideon putting out the fleece. In chapter 7, God reduces the Jewish army to build Gideon's faith. We'll see this 32,000 person army be whittled down to 3,000 people. After that, God is going to actually send Gideon into the enemy lines so that Gideon can overhear one of the enemy's dreams. So God lets Gideon overhear the enemy to relieve Gideon's doubts and fears, and he will hear the dream of a Midianite, which confirms God's promise to him, I will destroy Midian through this man Gideon. Midian and Gideon. So that's what we're looking at. So look at what it says in verse 36. Gideon asks for another sign. He just doesn't have the strength of faith to follow God into this battle. He needs more confirmation. Gideon said to God, if you will deliver Israel through me. Now, why would he say if? What did God say he was going to do? I will deliver Israel through you. I've raised you up. You will defeat the Midianites as one man. Gideon knows what the will of God is. He's not seeking his way forward. He just doesn't have the faith to pull it off. He knows what God wants him to do. That's clear. He's just not sure God will see his promise through. He just doesn't have a relationship with this God. He doesn't trust him. He says, if you'll deliver Israel through me as you have spoken, behold, I will put out a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken. He doesn't believe the word of God. He lacks faith in what God told him he would do. And he's asking for a sign. So imagine just putting out a little piece of woolen fleece, and he puts out this piece on the threshing floor and he goes to sleep. What he's asking for is in the morning. I'm asking for this sign, Lord. If when I wake up all of the ground is dry, there's no dew anywhere, but my fleece is wet, then I'll know that you mean business. I'll know I can trust your word. In verse 38, and it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. So God didn't give him a damp piece of fleece. It was soaking wet, and all the ground around him was dry. And so what does Gideon say? I'm ready, let's go. Nope, that's not what Gideon says. Gideon said to God in verse 39, it's just so reminiscent of Moses in the early book of Exodus chapter 3, pleading with God to find another man. Gideon wants more proof. Gideon, verse 39, said to God, do not let your anger burn against me that I may speak once more. I'm reminded of another story in the book of Genesis. Remember when the angel of the Lord comes to Abraham and tells Abraham that he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember the conversation Abraham had with him? Abraham says, well, Lord, let me ask you a question. Please, let me not offend, but please allow me this one question. If you find 50 righteous people there, will you destroy the city? For the sake of 50 righteous, God says, I will not destroy them. And what does Abraham say? Great. No, 50 is probably too much. I know these cities. What if you find 45, Lord? Let me ask you that. He goes from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. He continues asking God. He finally gets down to 10. If you find 10 righteous in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, will you spare them? And God says, yes, I will spare them. We know the rest of the story. There weren't even 10. That's how wretched the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had gotten, because God did destroy them with fire and brimstone came down from heaven. But here we have Gideon. Please don't let me offend you, Lord. I know you did exactly what I asked you to do, but can I test you just this one more time? I wonder how many times we go to the Lord and do exactly that. Maybe not in the same words, but in our hearts, the same thing. Still not sure. Do not let your anger burn against me that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let the fleece now be dry, and there be dew on all of the ground. So Gideon again goes to sleep at night. Wakes up in the morning, and in verse 40 it says, God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground. I can't imagine how wet God would have made the ground. I bet it was sloppy, muddy wet, and the fleece was perfectly dry. So Yahweh has confirmed His promise to Gideon through these two signs with the fleece. Gideon's faith is being built up. We move straight on into Judges chapter 7. Remember, in the original, there are no chapter breaks. It's just capital letter after capital letter. Someone came along a long time ago and split this Bible up into chapters and verses. That's not the way God gave it. So the story continues right on into Judges chapter 7. In verse 1 it says, Then Jerubbaal. Notice how little Gideon's name is used from here on out. This let Baal contend with Gideon. If Baal has a fight with Gideon, let him take it up himself. It becomes Gideon's name, Jerubbaal. And all the people who were with him. Gideon's ready to go. They rose early and they camped beside Ein Harod, the spring of Herod. Now this isn't Herod like King Herod. That is spelled Herod. This is a spring that's up in the northern parts in the area of Manasseh in the Jezreel Valley. Amy and I have been here. This is the Herod Spring. If you look at this picture on the board there, the spring comes up. You can't really see it in the picture, but there's a little bubbling back here. And this is the beginning of Herod Spring. It's a very short, winding little spring and creek that goes through the body or the bottom of the Jezreel Valley. Ein Harod, Herod Springs. This is what it looks like. It's still beautiful. I can't imagine that they would have moved rocks to make it something other than it was then. It's just a riverbed. It's a small creek riverbed. This is Herod Springs. This is what we're about. I put Amy in the picture. She'll probably shoot me for it. Just to give you an idea how little this amount of space is we're talking about. It's it would fit almost in the area between these chairs. It was a small bit of winding water with solid rocks all around it for the length of it. So that's where we are, Herod Springs. Listen to the story. So the army, they've risen early, they've camped beside the spring of Herod. The camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So they can see the bad guys. The red? This? No, it's a plant. It's a plant. It's a flowering plant like a bougainvillea or something. Bougainvillea. I'll tell you what, Israel is gorgeous. The colors and the of course it's desolate to God. The only reason it's gorgeous right now is because of irrigation. Israel is under the curse of God right now. They've been dispersed to the four corners of the earth. But nonetheless, the irrigated valleys of Israel are beautiful. Very, very, very pretty. Most of Israel is barren desert still. But no, that's a plant. This blue, I think this is like a camphor tree with these. We have some of these in Columbia Lakes. I don't know plants well, but where there is water, there's beautiful natural vegetation in Israel, as you might expect. He adorns, like a beautiful woman adorns herself. God adorned His beautiful land with some beautiful, beautiful foliage. So here we are, number 2, verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon. So Gideon's faith has been built up by the fleece. He's amassed the army. They're at this spring, probably stopping to get some water. And this is what God says to Gideon. He says, the people who are with you are too many. We're going to look at the numbers of these two armies in just a second. But God's opinion is to build Gideon's faith. The people, the army that you've amassed from Manasseh and Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, too many in the army. Too many for me to give Midian into their hands, for Israel would become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. So Yahweh has to build Gideon's faith here because Gideon has to get to the thought. Gideon has to develop to the thought that God will win this battle. That this battle belongs to Yahweh, and Yahweh has lifted up a deliverer for Israel and will defeat Midian, not man. And that's exactly what God's moving towards here. He doesn't want men to say, see how strong we were, even though the army outnumbered us by 3 or 4 times, we defeated them. Sing songs about this virile army. No, God said, no, we're not going to have that. No boasting. So, how big is the invading army then? God says the army that you've amassed, Gideon, is too big. So I'm going to move you into the next chapter, one verse really quickly. Look what it says in Judges chapter 8, verse 10 concerning the Midianite army. Remember the Midianites, the Amalekites, the sons of the east, they all banded together. By Judges chapter 8, the war's in full swing and most of them have died. But look what it says here concerning their number. It says, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Kakor, their armies with them about 15,000 men. These are the bad guys. All who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east. So there were only 15,000 of the entire invading army. There were only 15,000 of them that were still alive. And then we have this interesting fact. For the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. So how many people were there altogether? 135,000 soldier army. 135,000 soldier army. We'll see in just a minute how many Gideon had when he comes down to the river. 135,000 enemy troops. I want to ask the question, is it unusual for Israel to be so outnumbered? Or is this the way God plays this all the time? Look at what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1. God speaking to Israel through Moses. When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, did God know that Israel would go into battle against stronger armies with horses and chariots and infinitely more troops? Of course He did. Because somehow, Israel, I'm going to get you to bow your knee to me. Somehow I'm going to get you to understand that I fight your battles. I'm your protector, your defender, your rock, your fortress, your high tower, as we see in the Psalms. So God says, when you go out to battle and you see people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for Yahweh your God, not Baal, the god of the Canaanites, not Asherah, the god of the Canaanites, not Milcom and Dagon and all these false gods, but the God Yahweh, the God of Israel. Yahweh your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. So the battle is the Lord's. God goes along with Israel and He fights for Israel. I want to take a look at Gideon's northern army. Look what it says in verse 3. What about Gideon? Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh, all have sent their men to battle. How many did Gideon gather that God said, this is way too many? Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people. We're in Judges 7 verse 3. Proclaim in the hearing of the people. So God is telling Gideon what to do. And this is what Gideon says to the people, to the army. Whoever is afraid and trembling. Imagine saying that to your troops. Boys, we're about to go into battle. If anybody of you are too scared to do it, please return home now. Put your guns down. I mean, just drop them right in front of you and get off the battlefield. It's exactly what God tells Gideon to do. Whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. So how many were in Gideon's army? 22,000 were afraid and left, 10,000 stayed. You add the two numbers together, 32,000 people. So you have 135,000 bad guys, 135. Gideon has amassed an army of 32,000, less than 25% of the enemy army, and God says that's way too big, way too many. Wow. What would Gideon think? Talk about God building up Gideon's faith. I saw you make the altar to me. I came to you as the angel of the Lord and whisked up that food, that offering and fire. I gave you the wet fleece, then I gave you the dry fleece, and I am going to make you believe in me. I'm going to whittle your army down to an unbelievably, ridiculously low number and take out 135,000 troops. Watch me do it, Gideon. Is it unusual that God would tell the fearful soldiers to go home? What are your thoughts? Has God ever told the army of Israel, when you go into battle, if you're too afraid to fight, you're free from fighting, you don't have to go to battle? Deuteronomy 20 verse 8. Then the officers shall speak further to the people. This is the same verse we were just in, same chapter in Deuteronomy when he's speaking of warfare. When you go in and they have horses and chariots and larger armies, the very next verse he says this. The officers shall speak further to the people and say, who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? You think there are any soldiers in wars today that are afraid to be there, who really don't want to be there? Of course there are. And what does God say? Get them off the battlefield. Get them off the battlefield. Who's the man that's afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's hearts melt like his heart. Not good for morale. It's not good for morale. This is the way the Lord fights a battle. If I got to go against 135,000 troops with 300 men, I've got no problem with it, the Lord says. But I'm going to take the right 300 men. And so in the Bible we see this whittling down of troops to take the troops that are prepared to fight for the nation Israel and no one else. Another question, I'm going to hit this quickly. If you know anything about the map, in verse 3 it says, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. Mount Gilead, as we know, Gilead is on the eastern side of the Jordan River. It's on the wrong side of the river. It's not anywhere near where this battle takes place. It's not anywhere near the Ein Harod, the spring of Herod. It's hundreds of miles away, at least 150, 200 miles away. But I'm going to introduce you to what is probably a scribal error. What I mean by that is, remember that the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was written in Hebrew. And Hebrew has very specific jots and tittles and dots and markings in it. What probably, according to scholars, and I believe this, what he's probably referring to is Mount Gilboa, not Mount Gilead. Now let me say one more thing. This has already gone on too long. Hebrew, as it was presented to us, as the Bible is written, had no vowels. They spoke the vowels. They didn't write the vowels. It was consonant after consonant. If I would have written my name, it would have simply been RCK. There would be no I in it. It would be understood that his name was Rick, and that's how you pronounce it, but they didn't have the vowels in the Hebrew language. They spoke them. They didn't write them. So when you see the word Gilead in the Bible, all you see is G-L-D. And when you see the word Gilboa, all you see is G-L-B. And if I could show you, you won't be able to see this, but if I could show you the difference between a Hebrew D and a Hebrew B, you would see, I don't know that anybody can see that, but this is a dalet, a line that way, a line straight down, and this is a bait, a line that way, a line straight down, and that little line at the bottom. If you were copying this and all you saw was that line, and you didn't see this line because whatever scribe wrote it didn't pin it in hard enough, you could easily make that B into a D. That's how difficult Hebrew is. I mean, think about our letters. Look at the difference between an L and a T. A lowercase L and a lowercase t. The only difference is that tiny little cross line. And if you didn't make that line dark enough, bright enough, be able to see enough, you could easily write down an L where there should be a T and change the word entirely. I think that's exactly what happened here. I don't think that Mount Gilead is the mountain in question. I think it's Mount Gilboa, which is right there in the area. You gotta... Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Scribal error. This is Mount Gilboa we're talking about. In verse 4, then Yahweh said to Gideon, let's continue a little bit, the people are still too many. So he's whittled down his army from 32,000. He's let all the scared men go home. So now you've got 10,000. And notice also that he doesn't put down the scared men. He doesn't put them in some other category as cowards. He just sends them home, that's all. Simple as that. Don't go beyond what it says here. Just sends them home. They're not fit to fight, that's all. The Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water. And I introduced to you again the water. Bring them down to the water, and I'll test them for you there. Therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. So God is saying, whatever test I'm about to give you, what I say goes. The test of faith again. Every one of whom I say this one shall not go, he shall not go. So Gideon has to agree to the rules. In verse 5, so he brought the people down to the water. Apparently Gideon agreed with the Lord. He said, okay, let's do this. He brings them down to the water, and the Lord commences with the test. 10,000 men making their way to this water. The Lord said to Gideon, you shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. Now imagine an army. Remember where it said the Midianite army was? They're just across the valley. They're in sight. And these men, prepared for war, are having to get a drink of water. So the idea becomes how cautious is a man of war when he gets water? And what God is separating out here is a guy who would kneel down on his knees and put his whole face in the water, put his mouth to this is most likely what's happening, put his mouth to the water and drink the water like he was drinking out of a swimming pool. Put your whole mouth, face into the water and drink the water, as opposed to a man who might stand up with the sword in his hand and look around and bend down and scoop water with his hand and drink like this. And that's who God separates. You think, what kind of test is that? Take it up with the Lord. He just wanted to get this army down to 300 men. Is it better to drink one way or the other? Did he pick the stronger men? I can't make that argument. All I know is the Lord was bringing this army down. So obviously the one who would scoop water up and bring it to his mouth were the more alert. But I just say that in passing. It doesn't matter how many alert men you have. When you have 300 against 135, it makes no difference in the world. None. They could all be Goliath, and they couldn't physically overtake an army of 135,000 men. So let's not get hung up on that. Verse 6 says, "Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to the mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled to drink water." I bet they were thirsty. I don't know how many of you ever lapped water up like this, but it takes a half an hour to satisfy yourself. If you want to get it done and get some water in your mouth, put your mouth in that water and you start drinking. The Lord said to Gideon, remember the Lord set the rule. Whatever I say, whichever group I say, that's the group. The Lord said to Gideon, "I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and will give the Midianites into your hands, so let all the other people go, each man to his house." Can you imagine the faith that it would have taken Gideon? Remember, Gideon made it into the Hebrews 11 Hall of Faith. Now we're talking about faith. I was outnumbered 32,000 to 135, but now you want me to send 22,000 home? And now you want me to send all the rest of them home? What is it, 9,700 men? You want me to keep 300 men to fight an army of 135,000 people? Okay, I'll do it. His faith has been built. He conquers a kingdom. His faith has been built by the signs that God has given him. His faith is being built in God. So God says, let all the other people go, each to his own house. And that's exactly what Gideon did. It says in verse 8, so the 300 men, what do the other men do? They drop their stuff. They drop their provisions. They drop their trumpets, their shofar, shofarim. They dropped what they had. The 300 men took the provisions and their trumpets into their hands. We're talking about war provisions. We're not talking about bread and food. We're talking about implements of war here. We'll see that in a minute because they remain hungry and go looking for food. Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Can you imagine looking at an army of 135,000 people and looking around yourself and seeing these 300 guys with these little trumpets? Tough day for an army leader. Tough day. Midian was below him in the valley. A couple of pictures and we're going to stop here. I just want you to see the valley of Jezreel. The Greeks, you may have heard a different word for the Jezreel Valley or the Valley of Jezreel. The Greek interpretation of the name Jezreel is Isdraelon. You may have heard the word the plain of Isdraelon, that the Battle of Armageddon is going to take place in the Valley of Isdraelon or the plain of Isdraelon. And that is the Greek way of saying Jezreel. Yezreel is Isdraelon. It's 141 square mile triangle. I think we're looking there. You can see Mount Tabor right here where they think Jesus was transfigured in Matthew 17. I think we're on the mount where 1 Kings 17 happens. I think we're on Elijah's piece of ground. And I'm drawing a blank. What was the name of Elijah's mountain? He called Ahab, the prophets of Baal, up to Mount what? Somebody, come on. What was it? Whatever it was, that's where we are. 1 Kings 16, 17, Terry. So it's a 141-mile triangle. You see another view. You can see Mount Tabor back there. This is the area of Naphtali. You know that because of this flag. In Genesis chapter 49, when Jacob gathers his 12 children, he calls Naphtali a deer, a doe, and Naphtali still has that on their tribal flag. So this is looking out from Mount Carmel. That's it. Elijah, Mount Carmel. This is looking out across the Jezreel Valley. So you can imagine another fact about the Jezreel Valley. Historians count at least 134 major battles have taken place in this valley. There's a story about Napoleon having stood on one of the mounts of Jezreel and looking down and saying the great armies of the world could fight each other in this valley, which is very interesting because what else is going to happen in the Jezreel Valley, the plain of Israel? The great armies of the world are going to fight against one in Revelation 19 who will come back, whose name is Faithful and True, who comes back with on a white horse with the sword proceeding out of his mouth. A name written on his thigh, the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Jesus will fight the battle of Armageddon in the valley of Jezreel, that dirt right there. So that's what it is. That's what it looks like. That's what we're talking about. That's where the Midianites are. That's where this battle next week is about to take place with these 300 lowly men who are going to blow the trumpet. 300 of them all at once, breaking, shattering their clay pots, terrifies the enemy in the middle of the night, making them think that all these people are surrounding the armies of God, and they continue to blow their trumpets, and they confuse, or God so confuses the enemy that most of the enemy dies by their own brother's sword. They turn on each other, can't see what they're doing in the dark. They panic and they start killing each other. Very interesting the way God takes armies out. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank